Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 16 of Series 9. The question for today is, what contribution does Hume's positive moral theory make to ethics? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 5. So my basic philosophical question is again, what can we do with human existence as consciousness? And I answer in terms of value and the will to value leading to a certain sufficiency of value. And because ethics is about values, I look to ethical theory to help me understand these values. We have looked at many theories of ethics, such as virtue theory, utilitarianism, and Kantian ethics. Yet there are many other theories of ethics like emotivism, expressivism, and contractualism, as well as existentialism and postmodernist theories of ethics. And thinkers like Rawls, Parfit, Nagel, and Dworkin also have their own theories of ethics. Today, I want to look at the ethical theory of David Hume. Hume is well known for his critical theories, but I want to look at his positive ethical theory. He is known, for example, for his empiricist theory of mind and his criticism of the idea of the self. His other major critiques are Hume's fork and his is-ought principle. Hume's empiricist theory saw mind as modular and divided into different states known as Hume's bundleman. This had implication for Hume's skepticism about a whole and undivided concept of the self. And this had comparisons with modern existentialist and postmodern notions of a fragmented mind. And Hume's critiques might even make him a kind of proto-postmodernist. Yet it was in the 18th century that Hume famously said that when I search for myself, I never can find myself as a self. That is, I can never catch myself without a perception without which I may truly be said not to exist. But Hume seems to think of himself as another object in his field of perception, whereas he is the originator of his field of perception, like an eye that cannot see itself. Another aspect of Hume's empiricism is seen in what is called Hume's fork. Hume's fork makes a radical distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact or existence. Matters of fact or scientific laws are discovered empirically and contingently and can be wrong. Hume's point is that such principles are produced from numerous observations and experiments. But it doesn't matter how many observations are made, they are never complete or absolute. For example, prior to the Hubble telescope, it was thought the expansion of the universe was slowing. Now, with the discovery of dark matter, we find that this expansion is speeding up. But this was a totally unexpected discovery, contrary to scientific orthodoxy. Hume presents causality as an opaque process of observations that he describes as constant conjunctions. Conversely, relations of ideas operate on different principles such as necessity, reason, and logic. That is, ideas can be logically necessary, such as in 1 + 1 = 2 or all husbands are male. Hume's fork is not the same as Hume's law or Hume's principle that deals with moral matters. The principle is that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be derived from a factual is. Hume's law or principle has never been unseated and thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. Even Sartre agrees, saying that ontology itself cannot formulate ethical principles. We have previously seen several arguments for and against Hume's principle that we won't repeat them here. Yet we can distinguish the fact-value distinction from the much stronger is-ought distinction. The fact-value distinction is useful but widely challenged by such as value-laden knowledge or science. But the stronger is-ought distinction challenges claims of moral or motivational obligation. Yet Ronald Dworkin sees Hume's is-ought constraint as a positive principle, not just as moral skepticism. Dworkin talks about the independence of morality as a separate department of knowledge, and this independence implies that moral value has a capacity to override other factors. I agree, even though I'm skeptical about emphasizing morality as an aspect of knowledge. Yet Bernard Williams makes a similar point about independence when he says that Nietzsche rightly claims that morality in this wide sense demands to be understood as self-sufficient. In another sense of sufficiency, Hume's empiricist theory of mind holds that reason alone can't motivate the will, but is the slave of the passions. I previously compared the independence or sufficiency of happiness with a certain sufficiency of value. I now want to briefly compare Hume's independence of passion or feeling with these other sufficiencies. That is, in my view, happiness, passion or feeling and value can have different kinds of sufficiency. I say this to differentiate these empirically based states from cognitive states like reason. This difference can be explained because non-cognitive states are constituted by their own inherent experiences, whereas cognitive states can be defined and constituted by the objects towards which they intend. So unlike Kant's rationalist theory of mind that emphasized cognition and reason to determine ethical value, Hume had an empiricist theory of mind that grounded his ethics, feeling and passion and moral sentiment. But Hume's problem is providing coherence and order from an ethics based on feeling and passion. This distinction is often framed within the cognitive non-cognitive debate as well as the rationalist empiricist debate. Cognitivists like Kant explain morals and motivation primarily in terms of reason and certain conceptions. Hume represents the non-cognitivist view, which seeks explanations in terms of affect and feeling. Cognitivists often suppose that a certain conception of things by itself is sufficient to motivate moral action. Kant thereby holds that we ought to follow the moral law just because we understand that the law is right. And because we understand the law is right, it is our duty to practice it. This is contentious, yet we can make a comparison with the case of motivation rather than moral motivation. One leading question here is, do we eat an apple because we desire it, or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively more plausible, but moral motivation is more complex and difficult to ascertain. Hume responds to the problem of discerning right from wrong with a theory about a moral sense. Yet moral sense theory, or sentimentalism as it's called, was also a general view widely held in Hume's time. On this view, moral distinctions can be made in a similar way to sense perceptions. That is, virtue causes pleasurable sensations, whereas vice causes uncomfortable sensations. Yet these pleasurable and uncomfortable sensations are of a certain type. That is, they are obtained by considering them from a sensitive and unbiased point of view. But there are a lot of problems here for Hume, as well as for moral sense theory, that need to be discussed. One of them is the need for an unbiased point of view that may be impossible in theory or practice. An absence of bias in theory implies a realist or absolute conception of things, and this view is rejected by a consensus in modern philosophy, even though we can argue for more or less plausible points of view. But there is also a criticism of contradiction from both modern cognitivism and analytic philosophy. That is, Hume's non-cognitivism is appealing to an objective and cognitivist view. But non-cognitivism should not be able to appeal to an objective or cognitivist view. Yet Hume accepts that reason is needed to discover the facts about social and historical situations, but that a judgment of sentiment or taste is required to determine the morality of an action. But it is the origins and justification of those sentiments and tastes that are in question, especially in the modern world. We can discuss at least 4 such origins, 2 of which were not known in Hume's era. These are genetics, the unconscious, ideas, and general experience. And this discussion is relevant to all ethical explanations in terms of feeling or affect. To begin with, general experience can produce taste, sentiment, and or feeling simply through casual likes and dislikes. So this randomness can't be an adequate way of establishing normative rules or principles. But experience can be generalized in a social construction of moral values, and Peter Berger shows how this can be done. Berger notes 3 steps in such a process. 1. There is agreement or consensus of what constitutes good behaviour, like condemning murder or stealing. 2. There is a social objectification of this agreement in religious belief, law, or cultural values. And 3. These objectified norms are internalized by individuals into their personal values. This explains feelings of moral compulsion and motivation to do the right thing. But this process explains ethical values which may not be moral. That is, there can be social agreement on a number of things that aren't moral, such as slavery, confessions obtained by torture, and genital mutilation. So general experience can't be an adequate way of determining moral action. Another source of moral sentiments or feelings is found in the conjunction or disjunction of ideas. That is, these must be ideas that have significance or value for the person apprehending them. The idea of Bluto beating up Popeye, for example, is unlikely to evoke strong feelings in an adult. But someone insulting your father, even without him knowing, will have a different effect. There are also many classical examples of ideas evoking negative or moral sentiments. A recent example is Festinger's Festinger's concept of cognitive dissonance between incongruent ideas. Others include guilt, shame, conscience, and even Sartre's notion of bad faith. But again, all these are subjective relations that don't provide reliable moral guidelines. Guilt and shame, for example, are often evoked by mistaken religious and social beliefs. The notion of bad faith provides an interesting subjective relation of inauthenticity, yet it is widely criticized for its subjectivity without an objective basis. These considerations are of ideas without any relation to seemingly objective concepts like truth and justice. This seems to undercut Hume's view that morality must ultimately be based on feelings. We will look at Hume's views about justice shortly. The unconscious is another source of feelings that is not only a source of intuition and insight, it is also an anarchic realm of aggression and disorder that produces conflict and guilt. So for C.G. Jung, the unconscious is a source of spiritual archetypes, but for Freud it produces the dangerous driving force of the libido. One of the first to describe something like the unconscious was Schopenhauer, followed by Breuer and Freud. And Schopenhauer, 1788 to 1860, was born 22 years after Hume died in 1776. So Hume could not have had access to a clear idea of the unconscious, and he could not have known about it as a factor in determining moral sentiment or feeling. This then is a difficulty for Hume's and others' sense theory of ethics. Genetics is another significant source of feelings that Hume could not have known about, and genetics has produced behavioural inclinations that are favourable to survival, not for ethics. The strongest of these instinctual feelings is the drive to procreate expressed in sexuality. The most important thing for a species, from a species point of view, is to survive, and survival must be genetically embedded. Social structures are too uncertain. Yet Richard Dawkins has explained how even ethical impulses can become genetically embedded. Dawkins poses a genetic rule of thumb for tribal life for ethical behaviour in the modern world. That is, tribes of people who care for each other are more likely to thrive than ones that don't, and that, like other animals, this behaviour would become genetically encoded. A problem here, however, is that such ethical impulses are contingent. That is, there is no certainty that behaviour must turn out like this, and many studies show that it doesn't. Or these behaviours may not be relevant to modern life, or need be chosen by thinking individuals. The outcome of this discussion is that these four bases of moral sentiment don't provide a normative foundation. That is, genetics, the unconscious, ideas, and general experience provide only contingent feelings, and that such contingent sentiments can't provide a coherent basis for ethics that Hume requires. That is, something else is needed even for forming basic ethical premises. Kant constructs ethical premises based purely on reason, but we have seen that reason alone isn't an adequate basis for ethics. My solution is to find an answer in the phenomenon of value, but at the moment we are discussing Hume's ethics. And Hume's ambitious objective was to discover the true origins of morals. To do this, he traces the moral sentiments to a very particular feeling of sympathy, and he appeals to sympathy to explain a wide range of human experiences. These include the arts and our sociability, as well as what is morally good and bad. Sympathy does have a wide explanative power, but again it is possible for sympathies to be misguided, and sympathy may not be broad enough to explain wider ethical concepts like meaning and purpose. Nor is it able to resolve the central problem of establishing moral normativity or coherence. Yet Hume gets to this point by criticising a circular argument that he finds in ethics. That is, it is often supposed that what makes actions virtuous is a concern for one of the moral qualities of the action. But the motive that gives actions their moral quality can't be a concern for their moral qualities. This is because the moral motive can't be the same as the moral qualities of the action. Yet this argument only demonstrates the subjectivity of the moral motive, and many of us would have accepted that anyway. Yet apart from sympathy, Hume does consider self-love as a motive for moral action, but he reasons that unrestrained self-love is the primary motive of injustice, so it can't be the motive of justice. Yet Hume holds an egoistic conception of self-love that prevents theories of enlightened self-value. This is because he rejects the selfish or self-love theories of Hobbes and Bernard Mandeville, and Hume ends up describing self-love as depraved egoism rather than a form of self-respect. Despite these problems with Hume's sentimentalism or moral sense theory, it has two undeniable plus points. One is that feeling is a viable way of discerning things as well as an antidote to rationalism. Another is that, against Kant, feeling of some sort must be included in an account of ethics. Firstly, as a means of discernment, feeling may give guidance to situations too complex to deal with conceptually. This may be expressed in the form of predispositions, intuitions, hunches, or even expert insight. Feelings may also be a way for the unconscious to express a preferred course of action. Such can be seen when we have strong intuitions about apparent truths that we can't explain. For example, that the good will is really good, or strong intuitions about moral right and wrong. And John McDowell similarly describes principles of action in Aristotelian virtue as uncodifiable. Another example is when Ronald Dworkin says we just know that torturing babies for fun is wrong. The problem is that we often believe such things are wrong when they are right. For example, Kant thought that telling lies to a mad axeman is wrong. And secondly, also against Kant, feeling seems to be an essential aspect of life. That is, to make decisions robotically or clinically seems to omit what is essentially moral. Kant believed that good acts done out of inclination rather than duty are not moral but amoral, and this is one of the incredible aspects of Kant's ethics that is widely rejected. The problem here, though, is how to integrate reason and feeling into ethics and morals. Another aspect of this problem for Hume is raised by G.E. Moore's work. We have previously seen how Moore's naturalistic fallacy was thought to endorse Hume's principle. That is, in Moore's open question, the naturalistic fallacy opposed contingent elements defining moral good. That is, the moral good cannot be adequately defined. That is because it is irreducible and shouldn't be confused with natural properties like pleasant. But this non-natural view contradicts Hume's idea of the pleasant as a moral criterion. I disagree with Moore that we can't define the character of the moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we can't definitively define any particular moral good or the highest moral good. This is because they are always liable to reformulation and further discovery. And this is an empirical view at odds with Moore's tendacious rationality. This brings us to two more consequences of Hume's empiricism. These are his unbelief in religion and his view of justice as a social construction. It's notable that, although atheism existed since the ancient Greeks, it was still rare in the 18th century. Only a few, like Hume, Jeremy Bentham, Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, were atheists. This marks Hume out as an unconventional thinker. Yet Hume's unbelief in religion follows fairly straightforwardly from his arguments against the existence of God. He presents these arguments in dialogues of three philosophers he names Demea, Philo and Cleanthes. His arguments consist in 1. The differences that these philosophers have about God's nature, 2. The teleological argument from design, and 3. The problem of evil for a benign God. The point of noting these arguments is to show both Hume's unbelief and his empirical method of argument. Hume's empiricism also regards justice as a human invention, but not one that is easily dispensed with. He held that a belief in justice was essential to maintain social order. Yet he also believed that justice had no place in close personal relationships such as the family. This reflects both his humanism and his pragmatism. That is, of justice having a social function but replaced by human bonds within the family. This is because he says nature has supplied us with the motives of parental love, benevolence and generosity. These views also challenge the idea of justice as having an objective or metaphysical basis. This is because justice invariably involves relations between people rather than metaphysics. For Aristotle, for example, as a complete virtue, justice was always in relation to another person. And John Rawls also described justice as the first virtue of social institutions. These comments suggest that justice is a social relation or a social convention without an independent existence. This view is underlined by the many kinds of restorative, distributive, social, personal and punitive justice. These many kinds of justice suggest social adaptation and anthropocentric construction. An objective or strict ideas of justice has long thought to be tempering with mercy, compassion and forgiveness. And punitive justice has more recently been regarded as a way of masking a psychological need for revenge. Yet such psychological observations stand in need of philosophical argument. Although we are more interested here in Hume's theories of ethics and justice, we can nevertheless look at some arguments to show the significance of his position on justice. And it's notable that Hume's concept of justness does not depend on religion or metaphysics. For example, studies of macaques reveal a perception of fairness or justice that can't depend on religion or metaphysics. In one study, macaques were fed celery that they happily accepted and ate. But when other macaques were given grapes instead of celery, they expressed outrage at this injustice. They banged their hands on the cage and threw the celery back out between the bars. This demonstrated perceived injustice even in macaques, so we can conclude that this perception of injustice is due to an awareness of some relative gain. It isn't due to some underlying metaphysical or religious principle that macaques can't have. And the psychological explanation attributed to macaques seems applicable also to humans. It could nevertheless be argued that justice for humans is based on rights that macaques don't understand. But both Bentham and Hume insisted that natural law and natural rights are unreal metaphysical phenomena. And this view has been defended by Wittgenstein, John Mackey and other modern thinkers. In my view, the ideas of justice and human rights are objectified wants. Yet they need to be no less essential or important for being human constructs. In conclusion, we can repeat the question, what contribution does Hume's positive moral theory make to ethics? Like utilitarianism, Hume's empiricism sweeps aside the untenable dogmas and metaphysics of religion, and his critiques of the idea of the self, causality, and the is-ought distinction are now legendary. Hume's principle on the is-ought distinction reveals an unrecognized relation to the value that has to be accounted for, and that moral value cannot be surreptitiously smuggled into the equation by sleight of hand. But although this ought primarily concerns moral value, the concept of value isn't explicit here. So in my view, this neglect is a weakness in Hume, but one shared by other theories. Yet his positive contributions are not only his empiricism, but also his emphasis on feelings in ethical behaviour. In Europe, since the ancient Greeks, the scholastics and the Enlightenment emphasized cognition and reason. This amounted to a widespread bias towards rationality and epistemology, countered by a few such as Hume, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And his empiricism can be seen to be related to his appreciation of subjectivities in feeling and sympathy. This is because, following Nietzsche, phenomenology has been described as an empiricism of the mind, that is, an empirical description of subjective mental states common to Hume and phenomenology. But as we have seen, both rationalism or cognitivism and empiricism or non-cognitivism can't provide an ethics. The problem is that cognitivism by itself can't motivate or explain experiential moral content, but non-cognitivism or feeling cannot explain coherence or normativity of action. My answer is a value theory that can provide both an ethics and a principle of life, that is, the will to value leading to a sufficiency of value that also guides moral action. But the topic of this paper has been Hume's moral theory, not value theory ethics. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com or philosophy of value workshops.